Have you ever felt that no matter how hard you try to maintain a positive attitude, something inside you continues to silently collapse, as if you were trying to build an emotional shelter in the midst of an invisible earthquake? There is an inner strength that seems to escape, an instability that cannot be cured with ready-made phrases or superficial optimism, because the true strength of the mind is not born from a forced will, nor from cold emotional armor. It is born from a deeper place, from a point within the soul where there are no more masks, only decision. This decision is silent. It does not shout, does not impose, does not show itself. It reveals itself when pain hits, when frustration consumes, when existential fatigue asks, "How long?" It is in this intimate space that the construction of the armored mind begins, a construction that does not begin in theory. It begins in ruin. It begins in the recognition that the mind, when fragile, does not fail due to weakness, but due to overload, due to excess invisible pressure, due to undigested emotions, due to unnamed chaos. Many believe that resilience is performing strength, keeping your head up, not showing failures. But that is just the shell. True mental strength is not mechanical resistance. It is deep presence. It is knowing where to rest your attention when everything around you roars. It is knowing that the mind does not need to overcome chaos. It needs to go through it with awareness. And this awareness is not born of blind effort. It is born of the frequency aligned with the purpose. Napoleon Hill said that a positive attitude is the invisible magnet of success. This phrase is not a motivational cliché. It is a vibrational key, because everything you attract does not come from what you intensely desire. It comes from what you sustain vibrationally. And attitude is exactly that, an active vibration, an energetic decision that expresses itself in the way you breathe, think, respond, and absorb. Joe Dispenza adds, "You cannot create a new future by maintaining the same mind of the past." And here is the bridge between two worlds, the mind as an electromagnetic field, and attitude as a frequency that emits, receives, and transforms. Shielding the mind does not mean hardening it. It is not distancing yourself from pain. It is not closing yourself off from the world. It is the opposite. It is opening up with discernment. It is expanding with awareness. It is allowing yourself to feel, but without drowning. It is staying whole, even when everything calls for collapse. It is a spiritual, emotional, vibrational practice. And it begins when we stop confusing positivity with denial, when we stop using positive thinking as anesthesia to avoid feeling, when we understand that not all positivity strengthens, some only disguise fear. What we are going to explore next is a path of intimate transformation, not a manual, not a mechanical method, but a journey within yourself, a journey that goes through emotional shadows, reprograms invisible beliefs, and awakens a new way of existing. You are not here to escape pain. You are here to go through it with a new awareness, because an unshakable mind is not born of strength. It is born of repeated choice, of the choice to remain whole, even when everything falls apart. And that is why we are here, to rebuild, step by step, the architecture of a truly armored mind, not as protection, but as expansion. Invisible mistake, confusing positivity with emotional denial. Not everything we call positivity is actually healthy for the soul. Sometimes, what seems like optimism is just a forced silence about pain that has not yet been looked at truthfully. It is common to hear phrases like, "Think positive," "Don't entertain bad thoughts," "You need to keep your vibration high." But what if, by trying to avoid sadness, we are only deepening the void? There is a huge difference between conscious positivity and emotional denial. The former welcomes the pain and transforms it. The latter sweeps it beneath the mind, where it ferments in silence. How many times have you felt bad about being sad, as if feeling was a mistake, as if crying was a sign of spiritual weakness? This is the invisible mistake, the belief that we are only spiritually strong when we are smiling, confident, unshakable. But the truth is that the soul strengthens when it is seen in its entirety. The mind shields itself when it recognizes its cracks without fear. The first step to developing a truly positive attitude is to allow pain to exist, without clinging to it, but also without running away. Pain, when denied, becomes a shadow. And the shadow does not disappear with pretty words. It only dissolves with presence, with conscious light, with permission to feel. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of training the mind to cultivate a positive attitude, but he never said that this cultivation excludes difficult emotions. On the contrary, a truly strong mind is one that goes through sadness with dignity, that does not collapse in the face of fear, that observes anger without becoming it. Real positivity is not an emotional aesthetic. It is a state of coherence. And coherence only arises when what we feel, think, and do is in harmony. Pretending to be okay is more exhausting than crying truthfully. Denying discomfort is distancing yourself from your own soul. Therefore, the beginning of this journey is not about thinking nice thoughts. It is about feeling with presence, about not being afraid of pain, because pain is also a teacher. It is also a frequency. It is also a passage. Shielding your mind starts by stopping fighting what you feel. You don't need to pretend to see light. It's already there, even in moments of darkness, even when everything seems lost, even when words don't reach you. You don't need to be strong all the time, but you need to allow yourself to be whole. And being whole means not amputating any emotion, not even the ones that seem wrong, because every emotion is an invitation. Every emotion carries a message. The mind that learns to listen begins to rebuild itself. True positivity does not ignore pain. It transcends it with active awareness. There is a fine line between ignoring pain and moving through it with wisdom. And it is precisely on this invisible thread that true vibrational strength is built. When someone says that you need to think positive, they are usually trying to help. But what happens when this guidance turns into denial? What happens when we use positivity as a way to escape our own soul? Pain does not disappear when it is ignored. It settles in. It hides in the silence. It manifests itself in anxiety, in exhaustion, in silent illnesses. Genuine positivity is not an effort to look good. It is an internal decision to illuminate that which was previously denied. It is not born from the denial of the shadow, but from the deep embrace we offer it. And this embrace is not a gesture of weakness. It is an act of power. It is the moment when we stop fighting what we feel and begin to transmute it with presence. Transcending pain is not about skipping steps. It is about going through each one with your eyes open, with a deep breath, with a conscious heart. Napoleon Hill, when he spoke about a positive mental attitude, was not encouraging emotional pretense. He was talking about a vibrational stance towards life, of an internal state that remains intact even when everything around seems to be falling apart. And this integrity is not achieved by force. It is achieved by presence, by the daily decision not to abandon yourself, not to remain silent in the face of your own emotional truth, even if it hurts, even if it dismantles the character that the world expects you to represent. True positivity is an energy field that is sustained by self-love, and loving yourself is not about forcing yourself to be well. It is about allowing yourself to be as you are, without judgment, without guilt, without running away. It is in this ground of acceptance that healing begins, where vibrational transmutation begins. Because pain, when looked at with awareness, begins to dissolve. It stops being an enemy and becomes a teacher. It stops blocking and starts to reveal. Shielding the mind does not mean rejecting difficult emotions. It means integrating them. It means recognizing that each tear carries a message, that each discomfort points to something that needs to be reviewed, cared for, transformed. The mind is strengthened not when it silences the pain, but when it learns to listen to it without being swallowed up by it. This conscious listening is what allows us to transcend, not as an escape, but as a real vibrational ascension. The silent trauma behind the search for positive thinking. Our ear. Behind many forced smiles, there is a deep fear of collapse. A fear that if the pain is finally acknowledged, it will never go away. There are those who smile at everyone but are silently begging for a safe space to fall apart. And often, positive thinking becomes that hiding place, a psychological refuge where there is no need to touch the wound, where there is no need to name the emptiness. But what is swept into the unconscious does not disappear. It only disguises itself in constant agitation, in tension in the chest, in chronic insomnia, in inexplicable feelings of inadequacy. Seeking positive thinking as a way out of pain can be a trap, because without realizing it, we are telling ourselves that feeling sad is wrong, that being afraid is a failure, that expressing insecurity is a lack of faith. But this is not true. These feelings are not enemies of the spirit. They are part of the human process of awakening. When we deny them, we do not heal them. We only silence them. And imposed silence generates illness. It generates blockage. It generates disconnection from the essence. Many of those who seek to live in constant positivity actually carry emotional wounds that have never been validated. Old wounds from childhood, phrases they heard in moments of pain. Swallow your tears. Don't be weak. You need to be strong. This emotional rigidity is an inherited trauma, and it manifests itself later as a desire to control emotions with affirmations, motivational phrases, and beautiful thoughts that alone do not have the power to free. It is not thought that heals. It is truth. It is the courage to look at what has been repressed with eyes of acceptance and compassion. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of cultivating the correct mental attitude. But cultivation begins with clearing the ground. And the ground of the mind is full of old emotional roots, many of them planted without our consent. Roots of unfelt pain, of hidden anger, of fear transformed into rigidity. Positive thinking, when used as an escape, only decorates the surface. But the mind is not strengthened by decoration. It is strengthened by reconstruction. To shield the mind is to allow it to come into contact with its own pain without judgment. It is to create a new bond with vulnerability. It is to realize that there is no shame in suffering, that the soul, when heard with love, begins to release what was held back. And when what was held back is released, positivity ceases to be a defense and becomes a consequence of a mind that, before being strong, was true. Many people use optimism as an anesthetic, not as a transformation. There is a form of optimism that does not heal, that only numbs. It is a type of thinking that seems enlightening, but in reality, only covers up what needs to be looked at honestly. It is like putting perfume on an open wound. The scent may distract, but it does not solve the problem. It does not close. It does not heal. Thus, many learn to use optimistic phrases as shields. They repeat mantras with no real connection. They talk about gratitude while stifling their hurt. They talk about faith while hiding their fear. They talk about self-love while feeling empty inside. This anesthetic optimism creates an internal dissonance, a disconnect between what is said and what is felt. And this disconnect, even silent, vibrates. It vibrates in the emotional field. It vibrates in the body. It vibrates in unconscious decisions. The soul feels when it is being ignored. The body feels when it is being pressured to look good. And little by little, vital energy is depleted. Because maintaining an appearance requires more energy than maintaining a truth. What Napoleon Hill proposes is not pretense. It is vibrational re-education. It is transforming the mind not through repression, but through the expansion of consciousness. He speaks of a positive attitude as an expression of internal alignment, not as a mask. But for this alignment to happen, it is first necessary to remove what is not true. It is necessary to identify where we use optimism to escape internal conversations that we have not yet had the courage to have. Those deep conversations that hurt, but that liberate. There is a positivity that strengthens and another that puts us to sleep. The first welcomes reality with compassion and decides to transmute it. The second denies reality and tries to replace it with beautiful phrases. But the universe does not respond to words. It responds to vibration, and vibration does not lie. If the heart is hurt, there is no point in saying that everything is fine. We need to descend to that heart. Listen to it. Touch it. Offer him what he never received. Permission to exist, even with failures, even with fear, even in chaos. True transformation begins when optimism stops being an escape and becomes a conscious choice. When you decide to feel everything that needs to be felt without losing hope. When pain is crossed with presence. When silence is respected. When light is not used to erase the shadow, but to illuminate it. That is when the mind begins to shield itself. Not with rigidity, but with truth. Not with ready-made phrases, but with a new way of existing. Vibrationally aware, at peace with what is, ready for what will be. Positive attitude as neurochemical reprogramming. Much of what we feel on a daily basis is not a conscious choice. It is a chemical response. Invisible flows of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, substances that not only influence our mood, but also shape our perception of reality. And yet, when we talk about positive thinking or a high mental attitude, we rarely connect it to what happens inside the body, as if mind and body were separate entities. But they are not. What you think affects what you feel, and what you feel determines the chemical commands that your brain emits. Napoleon Hill spoke of positive attitude as a decision, and it is. But it is also a practice of neurological re-education, because over time, the brain gets used to certain emotional states. It becomes addicted to certain chemicals. If you have spent years reacting with fear, doubt, anger, your nervous system has built habitual pathways for these emotions. It is like a road that gets stronger the more times it is used. Positive attitude, therefore, is not just about changing the route of thought. It is about building, with daily presence, a new biochemical route, a new path within yourself. It is not about forcing happiness. It is about creating internal conditions so that elevated emotions can be felt genuinely. Dopamine, for example, is linked to motivation and the expectation of reward. But when it is excessively activated by artificial stimuli, such as social networks, notifications, compulsive consumption of information, the brain begins to become insensitive to true pleasure, and this generates demotivation, emotional fatigue, a chronic feeling of emptiness. Therefore, cultivating a positive attitude also involves mental hygiene. It involves conscious choices about what you consume, how you eat, who you spend time with, what you silence, what you feed. Serotonin is linked to the feeling of well-being, self-esteem, and emotional stability, and it rises when you feel real gratitude. Not that memorized gratitude, repeated without soul, but the gratitude that comes from the body. That warms the chest, that softens the thoughts. When you activate this emotion with presence, you are also activating a new biochemistry. You are offering your brain a new reference of safety, of peace, of belonging. Oxytocin, the hormone of connection, empathy, and emotional touch, is released when we feel truly seen, when we have authentic conversations, when we look each other in the eye, when we feel accepted without judgment. When you allow yourself this type of connection, with yourself and with others, a positive attitude becomes more than a mental choice. It becomes a natural response of the nervous system. That is why thinking positively is not just a matter of mental focus. It is a neurochemical alchemy, an internal rebalancing, a choice to break with old emotional addictions to create new patterns of feeling. When you decide to cultivate a high vibrational attitude, you are telling your body, from now on, we are going to change what we feel, how we react, what we emit. And this decision, if sustained consistently, transforms the mind into a new magnetic field. Shielding the mind, therefore, is training the brain to emit a new signal, not with artificial effort, but with intention. It is allowing emotions to stop being a reflection of what is happening outside and become a choice of who you are becoming. Because, yes, you can become a person who vibrates in peace, even when the world is at war. You can become someone who accesses gratitude even in the midst of chaos. You can become someone who, over time, builds a new biochemistry of the soul. This is reprogramming. This is alignment. This is also practical spirituality. Body, mind, and energy as a single field. Integrated, conscious, shielded. How elevated emotions physically change your brain biology. The brain is not just an organ that processes thoughts. It is also a living laboratory, shaped by the experiences we have and the emotions we allow ourselves to feel. Each emotion generates a specific chemistry. Each emotional state creates a different brain architecture. When you sustain elevated emotions frequently, you are literally rewiring your nervous system. You are opening new connections. You are strengthening synapses that support peace, clarity, focus, presence. Joe Dispenza speaks to this very well. Emotions such as gratitude, love, compassion, enthusiasm, when felt with truth, stimulate areas of the brain associated with creativity, higher reasoning, and vision of the future. It is as if these emotions unlock parts of your being that were dormant. And this is not empty positive thinking. It is genuine feeling that activates a new neural frequency. Science has already shown that the brain has neuroplasticity, the ability to remodel itself based on what we repeat. Elevated emotions, repeated consciously, become fixed structures in your internal map. When you choose to feel gratitude, even when faced with something small, you are teaching your brain to focus on what nourishes you. You are showing your nervous system that there is safety in the present. This reduces levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and activates well-being hormones. In practical terms, you breathe better, think more clearly, and sleep more deeply. Your body responds to your vibration. It is sensitive to what you sustain emotionally. A shielded mind begins with a body that has learned to trust. In the same way, emotions such as anger, resentment, and chronic fear are not just bad feelings. They are chemical messengers that, if not transmuted, create self-sabotaging patterns. They activate the limbic system, reduce planning capacity, weaken working memory, and make it difficult to maintain attention in the present. In other words, living in low emotional states is not only uncomfortable, it is biologically limiting. It reduces your ability to see possibilities. It reduces your perception of who you are. It turns your reality into a projection of your untransformed pain. Napoleon Hill always talked about the importance of mastering your mind in order to achieve your goals. But this mastery is not a command of force. It is a consequence of biology in balance. When the body is at peace, the mind can expand. When the heart is calm, intuition can manifest. Elevated emotions create this fertile soil. They unblock the energy flow. They make aligned thoughts flourish effortlessly. Clarity in this state is not an obligation. It is a consequence. Cultivating these emotions does not mean being happy all the time. It means choosing, with intention, what to hold on to after each fall. It means observing the low thoughts and still returning to what anchors you. It means that even in the face of pain, there is an internal space that remains whole. Shielding the mind is exactly that. Creating with loving repetition, a biology that sustains the soul, an internal structure that protects, not with rigidity, but with presence. And this presence is built every moment you choose to feel what elevates, even when everything around you seems to pull you down. It is in this repetition that the mind transforms. It is in this repetition that silent strength begins to be born. Beware of the emotional addiction of invisible complaining. There are emotional patterns that repeat themselves so silently that they become part of your identity. One of them is complaining, but not the loud, obvious complaining that expresses itself in constant complaints. It is an internal murmur, almost imperceptible, that manifests itself as chronic dissatisfaction, as constant comparison, as the feeling that something is always missing. It is a type of vibrational noise that wears down the mind, even if you don't realize it. Because complaining is not just talking, it is vibrating. And what vibrates, repeats. This pattern of silent complaining is a cycle, an emotional addiction that the brain learns to reproduce because it generates a familiar chemistry. Feelings like frustration, self-pity, resentment, they trigger neurochemicals that the body begins to recognize as familiar. And the body tends to seek out what is familiar, even if it is painful. When you get used to this pattern, you begin to attract situations that feed the same vibration, not as punishment, but as an echo. Reality begins to reflect what is being emitted in the invisible. Napoleon Hill said that our thoughts become things. But we need to understand that thought is not just reasoning. Thought is also the emotional field in which it is immersed. An idea of abundance, if sustained by a feeling of scarcity, falls apart. An affirmation of confidence, if steeped in silent doubt, loses strength. That is why invisible complaints are so dangerous. They sabotage without warning. They contaminate the frequency of everything that one tries to build with awareness. This pattern often starts early. It comes from childhood, from environments where negativity was the norm, where criticism was more present than recognition, where fear was stronger than trust. We grew up believing that seeing the bad side was a sign of maturity, that protecting ourselves with hope was a way to avoid disappointment. And so, little by little, we start to put on the armor of complaint, without realizing that it disconnects us from what we want to experience. Because complaining is vibrating against, and vibrating against is blocking the flow. Shielding the mind requires re-educating your attention, not to deny what is wrong, but to avoid becoming addicted to only looking at what is missing. It is a daily exercise in presence, of noticing when the mind begins to repeat patterns of discontent and gently redirecting it, not with rigidity, but with intention. It is asking, what am I nourishing right now? What frequency am I strengthening at this moment? Because it is this moment that shapes the mind. It is this moment that defines the field. When you begin to move away from silent complaint, something opens up. The body relaxes. Vital energy returns. Ideas become clearer. Your vibration changes. And with it, what you attract also changes. Not like magic, but as a natural consequence of a field that is reorganizing itself. This is alignment. This is emotional shielding. This is the daily choice to move away from the automatic pain and enter the presence of creation, even if there are still challenges, even if it still hurts, because pain ceases to dominate when you choose what to sustain, and the mind begins, there, to become invincible. The vibrational pattern that hides in recurring thoughts of injustice, self-pity, and comparison. There are thoughts that, because they are repeated so often, go unnoticed. They become an internal landscape, but even when silent, they continue to emit a vibration that shapes our lives. When the mind repeatedly immerses itself in ideas of injustice, in feelings of always being left out, or in constant comparisons with the lives of others, it enters a low-frequency state that feeds on itself. Each thought becomes a reinforcement. Each feeling of exclusion creates more tests for itself. And so a magnetic field is formed that attracts experiences that confirm the pain that one is trying to avoid. Thoughts of injustice create a distorted perception of reality, not because the pain is not legitimate, but because the continuous focus on it distorts the way we read the world. We begin to see everything as a threat, as an attack, as indifference. And this vision, sustained for a long time, becomes a filter that prevents the perception of opportunities, that blinds us to small gestures of love, that devalues achievements. The feeling of injustice may seem external, but it is the manifestation of an internal vibrational field that has lost connection with its own power. Self-pity, in turn, is a state where pain becomes identity, where suffering becomes the central narrative. It is not victimhood. It is an unconscious attempt to be recognized, to be validated, to have one's pain welcomed by someone, by something, by God. But as this state repeats itself, the mind moves away from self-responsibility. It moves away from the ability to create, because when everything revolves around pain, energy stagnates, and the field of manifestation closes. not out of punishment, but out of lack of vibrational space for the new. Comparison, then, emerges as another type of subtle poison, a poison that undermines self-esteem, that steals the present, that empties authenticity. When we look at the lives of others with eyes of lack, we fail to notice what is blossoming within us. When we measure our path by someone else's yardstick, we stop trusting our own time, our history, our unique way of flourishing. And in this movement, we give our power away to the outside world. We forget that the only real measure of evolution is the coherence between what we feel, think, and choose. Nothing more. Napoleon Hill spoke of the power of the mind as a creative instrument. But there is no creation when energy is trapped in comparisons, resentments, and repeated stories of pain. What you think frequently, you vibrate. And what you vibrate, you attract. It's simple, it's profound, and it's transformative. The shielded mind is the one that recognizes these patterns and, with compassion, begins to dissolve them. Not in a hurry, but with truth. Getting out of these cycles requires a new choice of focus, a new ritual of internal observation, a new commitment to the silence necessary to listen to the noises that have become habitual. It is in silence that these patterns appear. It is in presence that they begin to lose strength. And it is in the conscious choice to vibrate differently, even if it still hurts, even if it is still difficult, that the field is restructured, slowly, deeply, irreversibly, because the mind that learns to sustain light in the midst of pain becomes, over time, unbreakable. And this is the true shield. The one that comes from the consciousness that does not deny the shadow, but does not allow itself to be dominated by it. Why most people fail to keep their minds steady under pressure. It's not for lack of effort. It's not for lack of desire. It's because of invisible exhaustion. The mind that collapses under pressure is not weak. It's a mind weighed down by layers of expectation, fear, self-punishment, and emotional urgency. Many people fail to hold their ground not because they lack the ability, but because they are trying to build stability on ground that has never been healed. They try to be strong on top of unresolved pain. They try to be unshakable without having learned, first, to be gentle with themselves. Under pressure, the unconscious screams. What was unresolved comes to the surface. What was pushed to the back of the soul resurfaces with greater force. And at that moment, many people feel betrayed by their own mind, as if it were turning against them, as if it were impossible to maintain clarity. But what actually happens is that the mind, in a state of threat, reverts to older patterns, those that were programmed in childhood, those who are based on defense, fear, and despair. Mental strength, in these moments, cannot come from willpower. It needs to come from a new identity. Napoleon Hill clearly pointed out that sustained positive thinking can only exist when there is clarity of purpose. But what happens to those who still do not have clarity, or to those who have lost faith in their own path? Pressure, in these cases, becomes an amplifier of insecurities, and the desire to remain firm ends up becoming yet another internal charge, another burden, another reason to feel like you have failed. Shielding the mind, in this context, does not mean resisting pressure. It means changing the internal basis from which you deal with it. It means training the mind to remain present even when the body goes into a state of alert. It means cultivating, above all, an internal space of acceptance, where falling is not a failure, where fear is not a reason to be ashamed, where instability is not a sign of weakness, but merely of a cycle that is still realigning itself. The mind that can handle pressure is not the one that does not feel it. It is the one that feels, and yet chooses. The one that feels and yet breathes. The one that feels and yet remembers. This will pass, because everything passes, but it only passes lightly when there is awareness, when there is presence, when there is enough emotional structure to not transform each challenge into an attack on one's own worth. True firmness is not rigidity. It is conscious flexibility. It is knowing how to bend without breaking. It is knowing how to retreat without collapsing. It is knowing that strength does not lie in resisting everything, but in knowing where to rest one's energy when everything demands effort. And above all, it is knowing that the mind does not shield itself to withstand the world. It shields itself to remain connected to the essence even when the world tries to disconnect. Mental strength is not born from willpower, but from a reprogrammed identity. Most people believe that being mentally strong is a matter of wanting more, of making more effort, of having more discipline. And, for a while, this kind of thinking even works. But only until the internal pressure becomes unsustainable, because no willpower survives in the long term when it is sustained by a fractured identity. When someone tries to stay strong without having reconstructed who they believe they are, the effort turns into exhaustion. And exhaustion, sooner or later, gives way. Willpower is a momentary fuel. It serves for specific actions, for quick decisions. But true mental armor is not sustained by this kind of impulse. It is sustained by the deep reprogramming of self-image. In other words, the mind only remains strong when it believes it has the right to be, when it recognizes itself as someone capable of dealing with life without having to defend itself all the time, when it knows that it does not need to prove anything to anyone. It just needs to remain faithful to its own frequency. Napoleon Hill said that whatever the mind can conceive, it can achieve. But this power does not come from a mind disconnected from itself. It comes from a mind that has become rooted in a new truth about who it is. Identity is the filter through which all thoughts pass. If you believe that you do not deserve it, your thoughts will sabotage your actions. If you believe that you cannot, your energy will vibrate in a blocked state, even when faced with the opportunity. Mental strength is born when you change what you believe about yourself. And this change does not happen with motivational phrases. It happens with internal confrontations, with silences, with repeated choices, with vibrational reprogramming. When you start to see yourself differently, the world responds differently. Because you are no longer trying to sustain yourself with strength alone. You are acting in coherence with who you believe yourself to be. And it is this coherence that sustains frequency, that sustains peace, that sustains clarity, that allows you to deal with the ups and downs of life without collapsing with each cycle. Reprogramming your identity means questioning the truths that have been imposed. It's about looking inside and asking, who is this version of myself that I'm supporting? Did I choose it? Or was it inherited from pain, fear, rejection? How many of my decisions are made out of self-protection rather than expansion? How many times do I limit myself because I'm still trying to protect an image that's no longer mine? Shielding your mind is about starting a deep process of liberation from your old emotional identity. It's about allowing the new to come in, not as an imposition, but as a natural consequence of someone who is no longer willing to live in disagreement with their own essence. When your identity changes, your frequency changes. When your frequency changes, the surrounding field responds. And what used to require effort starts to happen with ease, because it's no longer about fighting to be strong. It's about remembering who you've always been, before fear, before doubt, before the stories that taught you to forget your own light. The wrought iron metaphor. How suffering shapes an invincible mind. Iron, when heated to extreme temperatures, does not weaken. It becomes stronger, more malleable, more powerful. But it only becomes that way because it accepts fire, because it cannot resist transformation. This metaphor is one of the most profound for understanding the path of the armored mind. Suffering does not break us. What breaks us is resisting it without learning. It is denying pain as if it were a mistake and not an alchemical process. It is insisting on remaining the same version of yourself in the face of a fire that demands renewal. When the mind goes through adversity, it reveals what was hidden. That which seemed unshakable collapses. That which seemed overcome returns. And that which was dormant awakens. It is in this moment of raw exposure that we have the opportunity to choose a new way of being in the world. Not as a defense, but as truth. Suffering is a kind of furnace. It heats everything we are. And in doing so, it makes visible what needs to be shaped. what needs to be abandoned, what needs to be integrated. Napoleon Hill spoke of the need to transmute failures into seeds of success. But this transmutation is not magic. It is forged. It is built with presence, with humility, with surrender. It is the process of someone who decides that pain will not be their prison, but their foundation, who decides to see each failure as an opportunity to disidentify with old ways of thinking, who decides that no matter how many times they are hurt, it will not turn into bitterness, because they know that bitterness is the result of misunderstood pain. And the armored mind does not ignore pain, it deciphers it. Like iron, our mind can be refined. It can be made stronger, more subtle, more precise. But to do so, it needs to go through cycles. It needs to be heated. It needs to be bent. It needs to be tested, not as punishment, but as revelation. Each challenge reveals the density of our identity. It shows whether what we are sustaining comes from the essence or from fear. And this revelation, however uncomfortable it may be, is sacred. It is what allows the leap. It is what begins the vibrational reconstruction. When we understand this, pain changes place. It stops being an obstacle and becomes a passage. It stops being an enemy and becomes a tool. It is not about seeking suffering. It is about not running away from it when it arrives. It is about recognizing the fire and trusting that, if crossed with awareness, it does not destroy. It liberates. It transforms. It reveals a mind that no longer collapses before the weight of life, but expands with it. Because now, the mind knows. It is no longer a victim of the heat. It is a field forged by experience. And for that very reason, indestructible. The myth of spontaneous positivity. Why it requires emotional discipline. There is a widespread belief that true positivity should come naturally, as if it were an innate gift, as if all you had to do was have faith, smile at the universe, and wait for good vibes to bloom like a wild garden. But this is a dangerous illusion, because when this positivity doesn't appear on its own, when fatigue persists, when the mind silently collapses, the person begins to blame themselves, to believe that they are failing spiritually, that they are vibrating incorrectly, that they are behind on the journey of the soul. And this silent guilt becomes heavier than the original pain. Genuine positivity is not an instinctive reaction. It is a practice, an emotional discipline, an invisible ritual that is built day by day in the intervals between one disappointment and another. It is the decision, often tired, not to give in to what pulls us down. It is the commitment to the frequency we want to sustain, even when the world offers 1,000 reasons to abandon it. And this discipline is not oppressive. It does not force. It reminds. It invites. It creates an internal structure that supports the mind when the heart is still learning to trust. Napoleon Hill never said that a positive attitude was a permanent state of joy. What he proposed was a vibrational stance toward life, a way of responding to events with intention, not impulse. But for this stance to exist, it needs to be trained, nurtured, refined with time, with patience, with conscious repetition. The mind is not born ready for positivity. It has been programmed for years to react with fear, with defense, with pessimism. Reversing this pattern requires vibrational re-education. It requires new choices, new thoughts, new emotions practiced frequently until they become natural. Emotional discipline is the basis of this re-education. And discipline here is not rigidity. It is loving presence. It is knowing where to rest your attention when it wants to run away. It is remembering that feeling pain does not mean losing positivity. It is part of the journey. It is knowing that not every day will be bright, but that even on gray days it is possible to keep a flame burning inside. This flame is the intention to not abandon yourself, to not sabotage yourself, to not give up on yourself in moments when everything seems dark. The shielded mind does not live in constant positivity. It lives in alignment with the truth, and the truth, sometimes, is silent. It is unstable. It is tired, but still, it is whole. Still, it is worthy. Still, it is enough to sustain a firm vibration. Because firmness does not come from the emotion we feel. It comes from the decision we make, even when it is not present. This is the difference between waiting for positivity to happen and cultivating it with discipline, between wishing for a strong mind and building it with awareness. This discipline is a kind of prayer, a daily declaration that you choose not to repeat the same cycles, that you are willing to plant new seeds within, even if the soil is still dry, even if the winds are contrary, because you know that what blooms outside begins within, and the mind that learns to cultivate its frequency with discipline becomes fertile soil for everything that previously seemed impossible. How sabotage dopamine weakens your mental field without you realizing it. Dopamine is often associated with pleasure, motivation, and enthusiasm for life. But what many people don't realize is that it is also one of the invisible pillars of our mental strength. It is through dopamine that we access the energy needed to act, to persist, to believe that something is worth the effort. When dopamine is balanced, it gives us emotional energy, a kind of inner glow that drives us to continue, even when everything tells us to give up. But when it is sabotaged, silently, everything becomes more difficult. What once seemed simple requires disproportionate effort. What once gave meaning becomes empty. Life loses its color. This sabotage does not happen all at once. It is subtle, and it usually starts with an excess of artificial stimuli, a bombardment of notifications, an exaggerated consumption of digital content, small immediate rewards that activate dopamine quickly, but without depth. And over time, the brain begins to get used to this pattern. It begins to seek more and more. It begins to reject silence. It refuses boredom. It avoids any process that requires maturation. And that is when the mind begins to weaken. Because a mind that does not know how to wait, that does not know how to sustain emptiness, that cannot remain present without being constantly stimulated, is a vulnerable mind. Vulnerable to discouragement, vulnerable to dispersion, vulnerable to anxiety. Sabotage dopamine undermines the vibrational field. It weakens the sense of purpose. It makes any obstacle seem like an insurmountable wall. And when this happens, it does not matter how many mantras are repeated. It does not matter how many goals are set. The energy to sustain these desires is no longer available. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of keeping the mind occupied with a defined purpose. But purpose requires presence, and presence requires an internal system that is not in chemical collapse. Restoring the mental field, therefore, is not only a spiritual work, it is also a biochemical work. A task of restoring the balance needed to keep the mind clear, focused, and creative. And this begins by silencing the excess, by reducing the noise, by creating spaces where the brain can once again feel pleasure in the little things, where it can relearn to be enthusiastic about the simple, about the real, about the present. Shielding the mind also means protecting its dopaminergic system. It means cultivating habits that sustain vital energy instead of draining it. It means slowing down consumption, revaluing silence, rediscovering the pleasure that exists in what doesn't scream, in what doesn't shine, in what just is. Because when the brain returns to a state of balance, everything changes. Motivation returns. Clarity expands. The field strengthens, and the mind, previously scattered, returns to being the center. It returns to being a temple. It returns to being an instrument of true vibrational creation. Reversing negative mental focus in 3 steps. The human mind has a silent magnet. It tends to gravitate toward what is unresolved, what hurt, what left a scar. This inclination, often unconscious, causes the focus to remain on what is missing, what failed, what could have been different. And when this pattern takes hold, it begins to shape the way you see yourself, others, and the world. The problem is not feeling sad or frustrated. The problem is living trapped in these emotions, as if they were the only possible truth. That is why reversing mental focus is not a technique. It is a process of vibrational re-education. A deep emotional training that allows the mind to free itself from repetitive cycles of negativity. And this process begins with the simple but powerful decision to observe. Not to react, not to judge, just to observe. The first step is to name the emotion. Name it accurately. Don't just say, "I feel bad," or "I'm exhausted," but finding the root of what is being felt. Sadness, fear, anger, disappointment. The mind begins to reorient itself when you teach it to identify what is active within the emotional field. Because what is named loses the power to hide. Awareness is the first step in transformation. The second step is to recognize the pattern, not the isolated event, but the cycle that repeats itself. Where else have you felt this? How many times has this same feeling appeared in other phases of life? What is the trigger? What is the automatic thought that arises along with it? Recognizing the pattern is an act of courage because it requires looking at the repetitions with sincerity, without guilt, without judgment, only with the intention of understanding what the mind has learned to repeat. The third step is to redirect with clear, vibrational intention. And this does not mean pretending that everything is fine. It means choosing a new frequency from the recognized pain, not as an escape, but as a realignment. You can say to yourself, "I recognize what I am feeling. I understand where it comes from, and I choose now to vibrate in a different direction." This choice can be subtle. It can be made in silence. It can be done with a deeper breath, with a different thought, with a small action that represents this new frequency. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of keeping the mind under control. But this control is not imposition. It is listening. It is care. It is the art of conducting one's own energy wisely. When you learn to redirect the mind without violating yourself, without denying yourself, but with awareness and truth, the mental field begins to reorganize itself. Emotions begin to flow instead of stagnating. Thoughts become lighter. Presence is re-established. Shielding the mind is teaching yourself every day to choose the frequency you want to sustain. Even when everything around you invites collapse, it is remembering that each thought is a seed, and each seed planted with intention builds the vibrational ground where your reality will flourish, with constancy, with maturity, with soul. The silent factor that sabotages your frequency, punitive self-talk. Many people live at war with their own minds without realizing it. There is an inner voice that accuses them, belittles them, compares them to idealized versions of themselves, or to expectations that were never fair. This voice, sometimes subtle, is persistent. It questions every step. It corrects every thought. It ridicules every attempt at change. And over time, this punitive self-talk becomes a dense vibrational field where self-love finds no space to flourish, where self-esteem does not breathe, where the courage to try again is exhausted. This pattern is invisible because it disguises itself as demand, perfectionism, self-awareness, but deep down, it arises from a disconnection with one's own essence, a disconnection that feeds on old memories, criticism received, pain never verbalized. The voice that paralyzes you is often not yours. It is an echo, a residue of the collective unconscious, of family experiences, of poorly understood emotional wounds. And as long as it is active, as long as it is heard as truth, its vibrational frequency will remain unstable. Napoleon Hill spoke of the power of positive thinking, but this power can only manifest when the mind stops being a battlefield and becomes a temple of healing. As long as the internal dialogue is violent, no manifestation technique will be enough, because what you vibrate most strongly are not your declared desires. They are the thoughts you repeat silently when no one is listening. These are the thoughts that shape your energy, that define what you allow, what you tolerate, what you attract. Transforming your internal speech is a process of reconciliation. It is looking at that critical voice with compassion and saying, "I know where you came from. I know you tried to protect me, but I don't need you like that anymore." It is creating a new emotional vocabulary, words that support, that encourage, that respect the rhythm of your journey. This is not superficial self-help. This is vibrational healing. Because every word you internalize transforms into energy, and all repeated energy becomes reality. The shielded mind is not one that only thinks positively. It is one that has built an internal space where criticism has been replaced by awareness, where judgment has been dissolved by acceptance, where error is not a sentence, but just part of the path. This space does not appear overnight. It is built with silence, with listening, with daily choices to interrupt the old pattern and establish a new one. A pattern where strength comes from self-respect, where security is born from kindness, where true change begins, not by what one wishes to achieve, but by what one decides to stop repeating. And when this new discourse begins to be sustained, something changes in the field. The energy organizes itself. The body relaxes. External life begins to reflect the new internal vibration, because now there is space. Space to trust, space to create, space to be. The mind, finally, begins to remember that it was never a battlefield, but rather a portal to awakening. How an armored mind is actually an open mind. It is common to imagine that a truly strong mind is a closed mind, one that does not get shaken, one that does not feel, one that does not expose itself. But this is a distortion. A truly armored mind is not one that builds high, cold walls to protect itself from the world. It is one that, on the contrary, remains open even in the face of pain, open to listening, open to learning, open to the discomfort that precedes transformation. Because true strength is not resistance. It is openness with awareness. It is vulnerability with presence. It is receptivity with discernment. There is an important philosophical inversion here. Mental rigidity is not strength. It is defense. It is fear, disguised as control. It is the attempt to prevent chaos from entering, forgetting that it is in chaos that the soul grows. Those who are truly strong listen. And listening does not mean agreeing with everything. Listening is allowing the other to exist without it threatening your integrity. It is knowing that your essence is so solid that no opinion can destabilize it. No criticism can diminish your worth. No rejection can diminish your light. On the other hand, those who are weak protect themselves with arrogance. They react to everything. They close themselves off. They defend themselves even before being attacked. They act arrogantly because they feel that if they don't, they will be swallowed up. But this arrogance is a mask, and a mask requires effort to be maintained. It tires. It disconnects. It isolates. An armored mind doesn't need to prove anything. It is silent because it knows who it is, and this inner clarity generates a peace that doesn't depend on external acceptance. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of maintaining mental balance in the face of challenges. This balance doesn't come from hardening, but from conscious flexibility, from the deep understanding that everything can be heard, observed, felt, and still filtered. When the mind is aligned with the essence, it doesn't absorb everything that comes, but it doesn't need to close itself off either. It chooses what resonates. It releases what hurts. It learns from what bothers, because it knows that everything that comes has a message, and every message can be used as a bridge to a higher level of consciousness. An open mind is not a naive mind. It is an awakened mind, one that observes without dissolving, one that welcomes without being corrupted, one that learns without getting lost, and above all, one that remains centered even when everything around it screams for reaction. This is true protection, not a shield that isolates, but a consciousness so rooted that nothing from the outside can disturb it, a consciousness that chooses with intention, that responds with clarity, that vibrates with authenticity. When this mind is formed, life changes tone, conversations become deeper, decisions become lighter, energy stops being consumed in defenses and starts being directed towards creation, because there is no longer a need to prove strength. Strength already exists. It is in the way one listens, in the way one feels, in the way one remains open. Because being open to life, even after pain, is the deepest form of courage that one can sustain. And this silent, centered, compassionate courage is what truly makes the mind unbreakable. The bridge between neuroscience and spirituality, the electromagnetic field of thought. There is a silent wisdom in the way thought is transformed into energy. And this wisdom, previously seen only through the eyes of spirituality, is now also recognized by science. Every thought you have generates a vibration. This vibration is not abstract. It is measurable. It alters the electrical field of the brain and the magnetic field of the heart. What you think, you vibrate. What you vibrate, you emit. What you emit, you attract. This is not a metaphor. It is a physiological reality. It is neuroscience applied to the soul. The brain, with its constant electrical activity, emits signals that interact with the field around the body. The heart, in turn, has its own electromagnetic field, stronger, wider, more sensitive. And when mind and heart are in coherence, this vibration aligns with a frequency of order, harmony, and conscious creation. But when thought is fragmented and feeling is misaligned, this field becomes chaotic. And this chaos is reflected in the way life responds, because life is a mirror of its field. Napoleon Hill spoke of the mind as a center of creation. But for this creation to happen with power, the field must be intact. And this requires more than focus. It requires alignment. It requires that what you think is in harmony with what you feel. It requires that your declared desire does not contradict the silent vibration that is sustained behind it. Because the universe does not respond to speech. It responds to frequency. It does not respond to what you say with words. It responds to what you emit with presence. Spirituality has always taught this with symbolic language. As you vibrate, so will your world be. Neuroscience now confirms this with data. It shows that the brain shapes its structure based on the repetition of thoughts, that the nervous system regulates or deregulates itself according to the coherence between mind and heart, that the entire body responds to sustained emotional states, and that the surrounding field reorganizes itself as this vibration stabilizes. The armored mind is the one that recognizes this bridge, that no longer separates science from spirit, that understands that everything is frequency, everything is energy in motion, and that, therefore, every thought is an act of creation, every emotion is a seed of reality, every internal choice reverberates externally. When this awareness takes hold, thought ceases to be random, emotion ceases to be instinctive, everything begins to be conducted with presence, with intention, with the clarity of someone who knows that each moment of coherence is a brick in the construction of a new reality. And this reality, when born from the aligned field, does not need effort to sustain itself. It blossoms as a consequence, as a vibrational response, as a reflection of a mind that has finally remembered its true power. How a man came out of depression, using the 5 pillars of the armored mind technique. In the midst of the deepest darkness, there is always a point of light that refuses to disappear. Sometimes this light seems dim, almost imperceptible, but it exists. And for some, it is precisely this small trace of light that initiates a profound turning point. The story of a man who for years lived immersed in a silent, depressive state reveals this clearly. He was not broken. He was disconnected. His mind, once strong, had become a survival camp. Everything was effort. Everything was weight. Everything was struggle. Until in one of those moments when life whispers through suffering, he had access to a new model. Simple, but profound. 5 pillars that began to change everything. The first pillar was clarity. Clarity about what he was feeling. Clarity about what he had become. Clarity about what he truly wanted. Without this clear vision, the mind remains spinning in circles. Clarity did not come as a divine revelation. It came through discomfort, of looking in the mirror and recognizing that he no longer knew who he was. That pain had taken the place of identity, and from that point on, he began to write, not to understand, but to hear himself, to see himself, to name himself again. The second pillar was belief, not in something external, but in the possibility of change. Even if it was minimal, even if it was slow, even if it was painful. He did not believe that he would be cured overnight, but he began to believe that he could take a step, just one. And in that step, he created a microspace where his mind could breathe. The belief was not about blind faith. It was about making room for a new possibility of himself, the possibility of not being the one who suffers forever, the possibility of there being something beyond the pain. The third pillar was consistency. Nothing flourishes without repetition, without rhythm, without structure. He began to create small rituals, waking up and breathing for 2 minutes in silence, writing a thought of gratitude, walking for 5 minutes in contact with nature. The mind, previously chaotic, began to find anchor points, and these points, repeated every day, became the soil. The consistency was minimal, but it was real, and therefore transformative. The fourth pillar was coherence. It was not enough to think one thing and live another. It was not enough to desire peace and cultivate chaos. He began to align his choices with what he really wanted to sustain. If he wanted internal silence, he avoided external noise. If he wanted healing, he chose what nourished him. He stopped negotiating with his old saboteurs, not out of rigidity, but out of love. A new love. A love that is born when the soul tires of abandoning itself. The fifth pillar was connection with something greater, with something beyond understanding. For him, it was God. For others, it could be the universe, the quantum field, the presence. It doesn't matter what it's called. What matters is that this connection became his refuge, his source. He began to understand that he was not alone, that there was something sustaining the invisible, that there was intelligence in life, and that this intelligence responded to his frequency. This connection did not come as a sudden faith. It was born in silence, in the moments when nothing made sense, but he still chose to breathe. He chose to trust. That man's mind did not become immune to pain, but it became incapable of being destroyed by it, because now there was structure, there were pillars, there was awareness, and above all, there was a new vibrational identity being sustained, an identity that does not deny suffering, but is not defined by it, an identity that remembers every day that true armor is not invulnerability. It is integrity. It is presence. It is light that stays on even in the dark. It's not about what happens, but about what you absorb. There are people who go through intense storms and still walk with a calm heart. Others, faced with small adversities, collapse. The difference is not in what happens outside, but in the way each person absorbs what life presents. The mind, when untrained, interprets everything as a threat. It absorbs every criticism as rejection, every silence as abandonment, every disagreement as a personal failure. And so the external gains a power that it should never have had. It becomes sovereign over the internal state. But the armored mind operates differently. It filters. It selects what deserves to be absorbed and what should be returned to the world. This is not indifference. It is emotional intelligence. It is vibrational maturity. It is the deep understanding that you cannot control what comes from outside, but you can decide what becomes your internal field. And this decision changes everything, because when you start choosing what you absorb, you start creating space. Space for clarity, space for lightness, space for the conscious creation of one's own frequency. Napoleon Hill always insisted on the importance of keeping the mind focused on what one desires and not on what one fears. But this focus only becomes possible when the mind stops reacting to everything that touches its surface, because reacting is instinctive, but absorbing is a choice. And this choice is made with every thought, every emotion, every interaction. It's not about protecting yourself from the world. It's about knowing that the world is made of stimuli, but that the frequency you sustain is your responsibility. Reactivity is automatic. It happens when the mind is in a state of survival. It's impulse. It's defense. But emotional absorption is trainable. And training the mind not to absorb what doesn't nourish it is one of the most effective ways to shield your energy. This doesn't mean becoming cold, distant, insensitive. It means developing a type of presence so integral that the external no longer finds a way to infiltrate. It means becoming so aware of who you are that no opinion, no judgment, no dirty look can shake your vibration. This awareness creates a new rhythm, a new way of existing, a way where you are no longer a hostage to circumstances, but a conductor of your own frequency, where the pain of others is not carried as your own, where dense energies no longer lodge in your field, where words spoken in anger are returned to silence and not transformed into wounds, because you understand that absorbing is giving permission, and that there are things that simply do not deserve space within you. The shielded mind is, above all, a conscious mind, one that knows that each thought can be a choice, that each sensation can be observed before it becomes truth, that each energy received can be filtered before it settles. And this awareness, when cultivated, creates a vibrational field so clear that nothing from the outside can enter without your permission. Because now you are no longer what the world says, you are what you decide to sustain. And this decision, repeated with presence, transforms chaos into calm, pain into learning, the mind into a temple, undigested fear that disguises itself as emotional control. There is a type of apparent strength that on the outside seems like stability, but on the inside is just an elegant way of not getting in touch with one's own vulnerability. It is control. This continuous attempt to manage every detail, every response, every emotion often does not arise from wisdom. It arises from fear, a fear so deep that it has become a habit. And over time, this habit disguises itself as a virtue. It is praised as self-control, but in reality, it is emotional containment, a silent blockage that prevents energy from flowing truthfully. Control is one of the most sophisticated ways of disguising fear. It gives the illusion of power, of mastery over oneself and others. But behind this facade, there is tension, there is rigidity, there is fatigue, because control is exhausting. It requires constant vigilance. It requires denying one's own instincts. It requires hiding emotions that have not yet been understood. And this repression silently implodes the frequency, not all at once, but drop by drop, until everything inside starts to weigh down. Napoleon Hill spoke of the power of a focused mind, of the importance of a positive mental attitude. But a positive attitude is not emotional rigidity. It is not about swallowing feelings. It is not about stifling discomfort. On the contrary, it is about allowing yourself to feel consciously. It is about creating internal space so that fear no longer needs to disguise itself, so that it can be looked at, heard, dissolved. Because fear, when not heard, screams through the body. It turns into anxiety, into hyper-control, into symptoms that positive thinking can no longer camouflage. This disguised fear is treacherous because it seems like strength, it seems like maturity, but deep down, it is just an invisible prison, an armor that prevents contact with the most sensitive and, therefore, most powerful part of the being. An armored mind is not a mind that controls everything. It is a mind that trusts, that surrenders to the flow with discernment, that does not need to be in control all the time, because it has learned to rest in its own vibration. You have learned that real security is not in control, but in the coherence between emotion and truth. When you begin to dissolve this fear, the field opens, rigidity dissolves, the body relaxes, vital energy returns, because energy only flows when it is not being contained, and emotional containment steals life. It steals shine. It steals presence. It is not fear that blocks manifestation. It is what we do with it. When fear is felt and released, it transforms. When it is denied and accumulated, it paralyzes. It transforms into a dense field that repels everything that the soul is trying to attract. Therefore, shielding the mind is also learning to let go, letting go of the fear of feeling, letting go of the fear of falling, letting go of the fear of not always being in control. Because true security is born when you allow yourself to be vulnerable without losing your essence. And this essence, when respected, becomes the force that no external pressure can destroy, a force that does not shout, that does not impose itself, but that vibrates. And by vibrating in truth, it attracts what is real, it sustains what is light, and transforms life into a reflection of the soul, not of fear. A shielded mind is not invulnerable, it is conscious. There is a mistaken idea that shielding the mind means making it immune to pain, impervious to emotions, unshakable in the face of challenges. But this is a dangerous illusion, because a truly shielded mind is not one that does not feel. It is one that feels deeply but does not get lost in feeling. It is one that recognizes pain but does not identify with it. It is one that welcomes emotions but does not allow them to define its identity. Shielding the mind is not building a wall. It is cultivating a garden, an internal space where emotions can flourish without becoming weeds, where thoughts can arise without turning into storms, where consciousness observes everything with presence but without attachment. Because true strength is not in avoiding suffering, but in going through it with wisdom, in allowing each experience, no matter how challenging, to become an opportunity for growth, learning, and expansion. Napoleon Hill understood this. In his works, he emphasized the importance of mastering one's mind, not to suppress it, but to direct it. He knew that power lies in the ability to choose the thoughts we entertain, the emotions we cultivate, the beliefs we hold. And this conscious choice is what differentiates a reactive mind from a creative mind, a mind that reacts to the world from a mind that transforms it. The shielded mind is, therefore, an awakened mind, one that recognizes its patterns, its conditioning, its limitations, but instead of clinging to them, it chooses to transcend them. It chooses to rewrite its internal history. It chooses to be the author of its own reality. And this choice is not made just once. It is a daily practice, an ongoing commitment to one's own evolution. Shielding the mind is ultimately an act of love. Love for oneself, love for one's own journey, love for life in its entirety. Because when we truly love, we no longer need to protect ourselves from the world. We can simply be in it, with presence, with courage, with authenticity. And that is the true armor, an open mind, a full heart, a free soul. How to transmute anxiety into vibrational strength with aligned intention. Anxiety is not just an emotion. It is an excess of future without anchoring in the present. It is a desperate attempt by the mind to control what does not yet exist, to avoid pain that has not yet occurred, to foresee paths that have not yet been traced. Anxiety arises when energy projects itself out of the now and gets lost in mental scenarios created by fear, doubt, and insecurity. And the more this energy is fed, the more the field becomes disorganized. The vibration weakens. Clarity dissolves. The body goes on alert. The heart accelerates for no reason, and everything begins to seem bigger than it really is. But there is a silent truth that needs to be remembered. Anxiety carries a potential strength. It is not the problem. It is the signal. It is the indicator that something inside needs redirection. Because the same energy that feeds mental chaos can be transmuted into presence, into creation, into vibrational strength. And this transmutation begins with a single question. Where am I sending my attention? Napoleon Hill spoke passionately about the importance of focus. For him, directed thought was the key to shaping reality. And in practice, this is exactly what transforms anxiety into strength, redirecting intention. When the anxious mind is called back to the now, when it is gently guided to the body, to the breath, to the present space, something begins to change. The energy that was previously escaping returns. The frequency that was previously fragmented begins to organize itself. Intention is the turning point. And it is not about creating a grand or unattainable intention. Just choose a simple but firm direction. It could be, in this moment, I choose to breathe with awareness. Or, in this instant, I return to myself. These are silent affirmations that do not promise an immediate solution, but that anchor. And by anchoring, the vibration stabilizes, because the mind does not need to solve everything now. It only needs to remember that it is safe in this moment, that it does not need to run away, that it can stay. Transmuting anxiety does not require strength. It requires repetition. It requires that every time the mind escapes into the future, it be gently brought back, not with scolding, not with rigidity, but with acceptance, as if to say, I see that you are afraid, but here and now, we are at peace. This type of presence does not nullify anxiety. It dissolves it, little by little, without rushing, like someone undoing a knot with patience and care. Shielding the mind against anxiety does not mean silencing it. It means listening to it with maturity and deciding that it will no longer drive your frequency. It means using restlessness as a reminder that something needs internal attention. It means transforming the impulse to escape into an invitation to be present. And, in this process, energy starts to circulate again. Clarity returns. The field expands, because the mind is no longer adrift. It is anchored. And this anchoring, done with aligned intention, is what transforms anxiety into strength, into light, into vibrational direction, the secret to emotional coherence, and why it's more powerful than motivation. Motivation is a quick flame. Coherence is a continuous fire. Motivation comes and goes like the wind. It can be sparked by a phrase, a video, a conversation, but just as it appears, it also fades, because motivation is linked to the external. It depends on stimulus, and everything that depends on the external sooner or later fails. Coherence, on the other hand, is born from within. It doesn't need applause, recognition, or favorable circumstances. It only needs truth, an alignment between what you feel, what you think, and what you do. The shielded mind is not driven by motivation. It is driven by vibrational coherence, by a silent integrity that sustains the frequency, even when there is no energy, even when everything seems heavy, even when there are no apparent results. Because those who act with coherence are not looking for approval. They are committed to their own essence. They are committed to what they know to be true, even if no one sees it, even if no one values it. Because that is true power, following in tune with your soul without depending on external confirmation. Napoleon Hill spoke of the importance of a defined purpose, but purpose can only be sustained with coherence, because without coherence, it becomes just a nice idea, an inspiring theory, an unattainable dream. With coherence, it becomes practice, reality, a path. And this path is not perfect. It is imperfect, but continuous. It is made up of small but consistent choices. Choices that say, even when I am tired, I honor my truth. Even when I am not motivated, I remain present. Even when I am not completely clear, I continue with faith. Emotional coherence is, above all, a form of self-respect. When you choose to sustain a vibration aligned with your truth, you are saying to yourself, I take myself seriously. I value my energy. I recognize the impact of my frequency. And this choice changes everything. Because the universe does not respond to the intensity of an impulse. It responds to the constancy of a vibration. And constancy is only possible when there is coherence between mind, heart, and action. The mind becomes disorganized when it is forced to sustain what it does not believe, when it is forced to act one way and feel another, when it lives in dissonance between what it says and what it does. This generates internal noise. It generates guilt. It generates disconnection. But when there is coherence, everything aligns. Thoughts flow. Intuition awakens. The body relaxes, because there is no longer any conflict between what one experiences and what one desires. There is only truth being sustained. And this truth, repeated in simple gestures, becomes a field. A strong field. Clear. Impossible to be knocked down by any lack of motivation. That is why the truly strong mind is not the most enthusiastic. It is the most coherent. It is not the one that shouts the loudest. It is the one that vibrates the cleanest. It is not the one that waits to feel good to act. It is the one that acts with presence even when well-being has not yet arrived. Because you know that true well-being is not a starting point. It is a result, a reflection, an echo of the coherence that you choose to maintain every day, even on the hardest days, even on the longest nights, even when everything calls for giving up. Because those who live coherently no longer live by impulse, they live by decision. And this decision is unshakable. The vibrational ceiling metaphor. What's holding you back isn't the world, it's your self-image. There's an invisible limit that many people carry within themselves. A limit that isn't in their circumstances, resources, or opportunities. It's in the way they see themselves, in the image they've built of themselves over the years. This self-image becomes a vibrational ceiling, a ceiling that defines how much you believe you deserve, how much you allow yourself to receive, how much you allow yourself to shine. And without realizing it, you start living within this limit. Every time you try to go beyond it, something pulls you back. A silent sabotage, a fear of losing control, a feeling that this isn't for me. This ceiling wasn't created by choice. It was built by experiences, by words spoken at the wrong times, by unprocessed traumas, by emotional repetitions that shaped an identity based on protection rather than expansion. The mind, by its nature, seeks to repeat what is familiar, and if the familiar is scarcity, pain, rejection, instability, then that's what it will continue to attract, even when its conscious desire is different. Because what determines your reality is not what you want, it's what you believe you deserve. And that belief lives within your self-image. Napoleon Hill understood that in order to achieve anything, you first had to see yourself as worthy of it. He called it faith, but not blind, religious faith, a vibrational faith, a silent conviction that it is already part of your identity. When that conviction exists, the ceiling breaks, the field expands, the energy begins to attract new experiences that reflect this new inner vision. But for that to happen, you have to confront the old image. You have to have the courage to ask, who do I believe I am? And where does this image come from? Often, this image is outdated. It is based on moments of pain that are no longer part of your reality, but that still dominate your vibration. You are trapped in past versions of yourself, versions that were necessary to survive, but that no longer serve to live fully. And when these versions are not recognized and released, they become anchors. And the ceiling remains, invisible but powerful. Shielding the mind also means raising this ceiling. It is expanding your self-image. It is allowing yourself to see a higher, more dignified, more capable version of yourself. Not out of arrogance, but out of realignment, out of respect for your own expansion. Because the mind can only sustain what it believes to be possible. And the impossible only becomes real when you redefine what is possible for you. When you dissolve the old image and choose every day to vibrate as who you already are. Already strong, already abundant, already whole, already light. This new outlook does not come in a hurry. It is cultivated with conscious choices, with new phrases, with different postures, with decisions that affirm, I am no longer that version that doubted everything. I am no longer the mind that hid from its own brilliance. I am ready for a new vibrational field. And that field, once accessed, does not close, because the mind, as it climbs the ceiling, begins to recognize that there are no real limits, only old frames. And all frames can be broken when the soul decides to expand, when the vibration decides to grow, when the identity decides to be reborn. Why inner silence is more powerful than verbalized intention. Words have power. They create images, direct energy, and shape thoughts. But there is a place where words cannot reach, an inner space that can only be accessed in silence. That is where the real vibration lives, the one that does not depend on what is said, but on who one is. Verbalized intention may enchant the ears, but it is silence that reveals the true frequency, because silence does not lie. It exposes. It shows what is being sustained behind the speech. It shows the field, and the field is what creates reality. We often repeat positive affirmations as if they were magical mantras. We hope that by declaring something with intensity, the universe will move in our direction. But if the emotion that accompanies this declaration is one of doubt, fear, emptiness, that is exactly what is being emitted. The word says, "I trust," but the silence vibrates, "I do not believe." And it is this contrast that sabotages the field, because the universe does not respond to the sound of words. It responds to the coherence of vibration, and vibration reveals itself, above all, in inner silence. Napoleon Hill understood this in its essence. He knew that the true strength of a thought is not in the volume with which it is expressed, but in the firmness with which it is sustained in silence. It is the silent, vibrational, emotional conviction that defines how aligned you are with what you desire. It is what you feel when you are alone, when the world is silent, when everything around you is quiet. In that moment, everything that you are vibrates clearly, and the universe listens. Shielding the mind is creating this silence not as an escape, but as a temple, a sacred place where you can rest from the need to prove, to convince, to affirm. It is in this space that true intention is organized, that desire is purified, that identity is revealed. It is there that you hear your own frequency, and if it is misaligned, that is also where you can recalibrate it, not with words, but with presence, because silence is pure presence. And pure presence has its own sound, a sound that does not need a voice, a vibration that echoes louder than any speech. It is in silence that the field is remade. It is in silence that the body reorganizes itself. It is in silence that the mind returns home. And it is in this return that the shielding happens, not as protection against the world, but as a deep connection with one's own essence. A truly strong mind is one that finds peace in silence, that does not need to shout to feel safe, that does not need to affirm to know, because it already is. It already feels. It already supports. And this silent support is what transforms desires into direction, emotions into field, thought into creation. When silence speaks louder than words, reality begins to respond with precision, because the universe always listens to what you vibrate when no one is listening. Race, vibrational patience. The time of harvest is not the time of the seed. There is a silent collective anxiety, a latent desire to see quick results, to harvest now that which can only flourish with time. We live surrounded by messages that promise speed, instant transformations, miracles in a matter of days, but the soul does not work at that pace. The vibrational field obeys another logic, a deeper, quieter, more patient logic, where each planted seed needs time to transform into a root, a stem, a flower, a fruit. Napoleon Hill spoke of the power of persistence, of the importance of keeping vibrating in the direction of what one desires even when the world has not yet returned signals. This is the essence of vibrational patience, knowing that the time of harvest is never immediate, that the universe, with its invisible precision, respects internal maturation, that before something manifests itself outside, it must become stable inside. And this stability requires repetition. It requires surrender. It requires silence between stages. The mind that does not understand this comes into conflict with time. It accelerates, it forces, it compares. And in this movement, it interrupts processes that were forming, because impatience is a vibration that blocks. It is a frequency that tells the universe, "I do not trust." And the universe, upon hearing this, responds with waiting, not as punishment, but as a mirror, because everything in the field is a reflection. What you emit is what comes back. And haste emits scarcity, emits absence, emits fear that it will not happen. Shielding the mind also means accepting time as an ally, trusting in the pause, honoring the interval, knowing that there is a vibrational order being respected. that there is a greater synchronicity guiding the invisible, and that each apparent delay can actually be a realignment, a silent preparation for something more coherent with your new frequency. Because sometimes you change, but you still desire with the old mind, and time then invites you to desire again, from a new place, with new energy, with new presence. Vibrational patience is not passivity. It is active trust. It is continuing to vibrate even without signs. It is remaining aligned even without immediate feedback. It is acting with faith even when the fruits are still under the ground, because you know they are there, that they are forming, that they are growing in silence. And this vibrational certainty is what sustains the field. It is what keeps the mind shielded against despair, against giving up, against collapse. It is in this state that true creation takes place, a state where time is no longer an enemy, but part of the process, where each second is seen as preparation, where each day without an answer is understood as a day of rooting, of strengthening, of refinement, because what arrives at the right time does not arrive small. It arrives with solidity, it arrives with consistency, it arrives to stay. And the mind that knows how to wait with presence is the mind that, in the end, receives with plenitude, because it did not harvest in a hurry. It harvested with awareness. The unshakable mind is not born of force. It is born of repeated choice. There comes a time when brute force runs out, when effort is no longer sustainable, when energy, no matter how determined, begins to fragment. And it is at this point, where many believe they are failing, that true strengthening actually begins. Because the unshakable mind is not built at the height of motivation. It is forged in the silent repetition of small choices, in the decision to continue even when there are no results, even when there is no clarity, even when everything seems to be at a standstill. Napoleon Hill said that the correct mental attitude is the key to transforming defeat into victory. But what he called attitude was not a passing emotion. It was a vibrational posture, an internal commitment, a pact with one's own essence. And this pact is renewed every day, in the silence of the morning, in the midst of doubt, in the tiredness of the end of the day. That is where the mind is shaped, not in great leaps, but in the subtle steps that no one sees, that no one applauds, but they sustain everything. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "You become what you think about all day long, but not just because of the content of your thoughts, because of the emotional field that sustains them, because of the subtle frequency that remains active behind your words." It's not about intensity, it's about constancy, about repeating the same vibration with presence until it becomes identity, until the mind no longer needs to force itself to trust, because it already trusts, because it has already incorporated the frequency, because it already vibrates like someone who knows how. An unshakable mind is not one that never falls. It's one that knows how to get up. It's one that doesn't give up on itself in the process. One that doesn't betray its own truth just to feel accepted. One that doesn't trade its light for fear. One that, even when faced with a fall, maintains its center. And this center is not rigidity, it's rootedness. It's flexibility with awareness. It's a presence that welcomes but doesn't surrender. You don't need to have all the answers, but you need to have an aligned vibrational posture. You need to know where to rest when doubt screams. You need to have an inner place that remains whole, even when everything seems to fall apart. This place is your silent fortress, and it is not built from the outside in. It is born from the daily choice to be faithful to your frequency, to not corrupt yourself for convenience's sake, to not sabotage yourself out of insecurity, to sustain who you are becoming, even when the world has not yet recognized it. Because this is how the mind shields itself. Not by magic, but by conscious repetition, by the sum of the days in which you chose to remain whole, when everything called for fragmentation, by the vibrational memory that says, "I have survived other storms." By the wisdom that whispers, "You are not alone." By the presence that affirms, "You are ready for what is coming." because you no longer doubt who you are. Conclusion: the unshakable mind is not born of force. It is born of repeated choice. There is a silent wisdom in those who have decided to remain whole even in the midst of ruptures, to remain present even in pain, to remain faithful to their own vibration even when everything seemed to say there was no way forward. This permanence is not rigidity. It is surrender with awareness. It is surrender that does not fall apart in the face of chaos, but rather reorganizes itself in the midst of it. And it is in this surrender that the unshakable mind is born, not from forced force, but from repeated choice, from the choice not to give up. Napoleon Hill said, "The right mental attitude is the state of mind that every person must cultivate in order to transform defeat into victory." And he was not just talking about positive thinking. He was talking about vibrational integrity, a type of presence that sustains itself in any scenario, a confidence that does not shout, but vibrates, that does not need to be proven, it just sustains, because it knows, because it feels, because it has already become part of who one is. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "You become what you think about all day long." But it's not just about thinking, it's about vibrating, about sustaining that thought with emotional coherence, with spiritual practice, with continuous presence, not in grand gestures, but in the small choices you make when no one is watching. That's where everything is decided, in silence, in repetition, in constancy. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to feel strong all the time. You don't need to know exactly what to do at every step, but you do need to have a vibrational posture, an inner willingness to remain in integrity, to continue vibrating truth even when everything seems dark, because that's what illuminates, not force, but truth sustained with humility, with courage, with awareness. The unshakable mind is not invincible. It is human. It feels. It fails. It doubts, but it remembers. It comes back, it breathes, and upon returning to the center, it reorganizes itself. It rewrites, it recreates, and it becomes even clearer, firmer, more vibrationally aligned. And this clarity becomes a field that does not repel the world, but rather welcomes it with discernment. That does not close itself off, but rather consciously chooses what deserves to remain. Build your mind as a silent fortress, not to protect yourself, but to expand, to vibrate with truth, to walk lightly, to live with intention, because the true secret of a positive attitude is not an emotion. It is in the vibrational choice to remain whole, even in the face of falling, to follow with your heart aligned, even when your steps hurt, to remember every day that you are more than what happened to you. You are what you choose to sustain now. And this choice, repeated in silence, in presence, in faith, is what makes your mind an unshakable mind.